Time for another wine pop quiz. What is the oldest method for making sparkling wine anywhere in the world? And a little hint, it is not the champagne method. And at this point, I know some of you are already loading your muskets to defend champagne. We know our history, Dom Pérignon, monks, accidental bubbly. Surely that is champagne at the beginning of sparkling wine globally. And if you want to drill down into the details, we can tell you more. There was Dom Pérignon, and he spilt something on his monk robe, which is a bad habit. And then he walked off in a huff, forgetting about the wines that he'd made for a couple of months until spring rolled around and the climate warmed up and the wine warmed up and the yeast woke up and boom, accidental bubbly in a bottle. Surely that is the champagne method and therefore the beginning of all things bubbly. Actually, the truth is that what we just described is not the champagne method at all, but rather the Methode Ancestral. And it predates pretty much any other technique for making sparkling wine that you were about to guess as the answer to my trivia question. And I'd go a step further and say not only is the champagne method not the oldest or original way of making sparkling wine, but champagne itself is also no longer the global benchmark for sparkling wines everywhere. And again, muskets are being loaded to defend champagne because to many, the idea that champagne is not some unchanging, timeless benchmark of quality makes people feel uncomfortable. But the fact of the matter is that champagne has not stood still. Climate has shifted, picking dates have shifted, styles have shifted. In fact, the French agricultural department has quite literally shifted the entire appellation beneath our feet. So in that sense, even modern champagne cannot live up to this imaginary idea of classic, timeless champagne as a benchmark of quality. So then, brothers and sisters, what shall we do if we have not a single benchmark for global sparkling quality? Well, I'd suggest that we begin thinking in genres, of which champagne is just one. And I think I probably need to say out loud, because many of you are still in a rage-fueled haze, that champagne can be absolutely excellent. Perhaps champagne could be the Shawshank Redemption of wines. But if Jim Carrey or Bruce Willis had spent their careers trying to produce more Shawshank Redemptions, we would never have met Ace Ventura, or even worse, John McClane. My point here is, I guess, that it would be rather ridiculous to compare Shawshank Redemption to Die Hard to Ace Ventura, and yet, my goodness, man, all three of them are spectacular pieces of art. So instead, coming back to the world of sparkling wine, let's think in genres, of which champagne is an excellent one, but it's always going to be a kind of starched French tuxedo. It's going to be brooding and layered and structured. We know it's made from Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and it gets plenty of time on the lees, 15 months at least. And there's 2 fermentations, one in the base wine and then one in the bottle. And it's a rather serious affair, but perhaps you don't want a tuxedo. Perhaps you want a peach-colored sundress, in which case Prosecco is exactly what you're looking for. Lighter, floral, just a single tank fermentation. It's made from a grape that used to be called Prosecco and is now called Glera. Clever little sleight of hand to try and preserve copyright. And it can be a little bit sweeter, a little more accessible, perhaps less complex, but also less brooding. Or maybe you think to yourself, I do want a tuxedo. I just don't want a French tuxedo. In which case, Italy still has you covered, because you could drink Franciacorta, which is essentially a raft of wines that have taken the champagne method using champagne grapes, but all produced from fruit grown in Lombardy terroir. And so again, it's going to be a different expression. Even more different is what's going on in Spain, where you have Cava. Again, they've taken a traditional method, but why bother with French grapes when you have these super exciting indigenous cultivars like Xarello or Parellada or Macabeo? And Macabeo is also called Viura, and Viura is on this popularity rocket ship right now for all the still wines coming out of Rioja. So why would you limit yourself to a French tuxedo when you could wear a crimson Spanish jazz suit? And even South Africa has its own genre of sparkling wine. It used to be called MCC, it's now just called Classique. And historically, most of the best examples would be made using Chardonnay largely, but with a bit of Pinot Noir. But of late, some of the most exciting examples have been made using Chenin Blanc. And why not? Why would you limit yourself to Chardonnay when you can use this high acid, very precise, quite expressive cultivar of Chenin Blanc. And why not? Given that South Africa has become the spiritual home of Chenin Blanc and has more of it than anyone else in the world, why wouldn't we lean on that precise, expressive, high-acid cultivar to produce wines that are, in their own right, absolutely exceptional? So hopefully we can agree that it really does make sense to move beyond the binary and to treat the term not champagne as an immediate winemaking flaw, but instead to see that we have different regions, different cultivars, different techniques, and different intentions to produce a gloriously varied raft of sparkling wines from around the world. And of course, some are better than others, but that will always be the case everywhere, even within Champagne itself. And that brings us to today's Hand Drink Solo Curious Wine of the Day, which is made via that ancient method that predates all the others, Methode Ancestral, and that is the Daschbosch Methode Ancestral Verdelho, made with fruit from the Prosecco in South Africa. If we were to insist that champagne was Shawshank Redemption, then this bottle is X-Men Origins, the Wolverine edition. Now, I realize in that whirlwind tour of sparkling wine genres from around the planet, we kind of skipped over the nuance of what makes Methode Ancestral different. And in case you didn't pick it up from that initial story of Dom Pérignon and his bad habits, Methode Ancestral just involves a single fermentation. So it begins as any wine would in a fermentation vat or in a stainless steel tank, but then halfway through the process, usually, if winemakers are being precise, they will chill that fermentation way down, which slows everything down. And what you have in the tank is juice and yeast still with sugar unfermented in it. And that all goes into bottle, where those bottles are then sealed and fermentation is allowed to continue as the temperature of the bottle warms up. Of course, as the yeast starts to do its thing and sugar turns into alcohol, CO2 is a byproduct. So there's going to be a buildup of pressure in the bottle. Now, this could cause chaos if you weren't expecting it, as was the case with poor Dom. But nowadays, winemakers have a pretty good idea of what to expect, because they can calculate that for pretty much every 4 grams of sugar that must still ferment in the bottle, that will produce about 1 bar of pressure. And so Methode Ancestral can go up to 4 bars of pressure. But you should note that Champagne or MCC or Cava ends up at about 6 bars of pressure, which is really quite formidable. And that's because instead of having 1 interrupted fermentation, have 2 fermentations. The second one happens entirely in the bottle, which explains that far higher pressure level. Now, we could always dig deeper into the nuances of what happens during that single but interrupted fermentation. But probably what is far more important than any of the chemistry is what it actually tastes like in the glass. So instead of talking, we're going to drink. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, to be honest, it's not what you'd immediately expect from a Verdelho, because perhaps you'd be thinking there'd be citrus, a little bit of saline, salty sea spray type notes, some grassy herbal notes. But instead, what we're getting is really clean, pure, cool white pear, as well as a little bit of maybe some lemon blossom or peach blossom. But it's this white tree fruit that's going on rather than citrus and salt and grass. And partially, this is because the fermentation is kept really rather cool. And cooler fermentations take place more slowly, but they also preserve slightly more delicate elements that often are in that tree fruit, sometimes tropical mango, which is actually something else that I smelt in this. Those elements are a little more fragile, and so warmer fermentations can see them getting lost. The other thing to note is that the first half of the fermentation takes place in stainless steel tank, and the second half takes place in the bottle. So there's really no spot for oak to enter the picture. Although that said, as it warms in the glass, I have detected a note of what feels almost like apple pie filling, so a little bit of apple and cinnamon. And I thought, well, perhaps it could be oak, but there's no oak in the process. And then you think, well, it could be some cinnamic acid produced by carbonic maceration. But we know that these grapes were all crushed prior to the beginning of fermentation. So I'm probably imagining it all, but it's delicious anyway. Apple, cinnamon, a little bit of white pear, lemon blossom, absolutely beautiful. But let's see what it's like on the palate. Well, when I poured it earlier and had a look in the glass, one of the things I noted was just how beautifully fine the bubbles were. Often with Methode Ancestral, you can get a slightly coarser mousse, but this particular wine would be mistaken just on sight as being a traditional method production. So when it does get onto your palate, you get that fresh, fine, persistent mousse. And again, you get these beautiful, cool tree fruit flavors. But there's a little bit more, because alongside those notes of pear and apple and a touch of cinnamon, you get a really beautiful, persistent lime acidity, this kind of juicy lift that makes those slightly sweeter tree fruit notes stand on edge. And if you wanted to talk specifics about how much sugar was left after fermentation in those bottles, well, you can't get a single number because every single bottle is its own little fermentation universe. And so there will be micro variations. But the rough sugar level is between 4.5 to 4.8 grams of sugar, which, as you can see from the graph, is on the very dry end of the scale. But what that combination of a little bit of sweet pear fruit and that juicy lime acidity does is persist well into the tail. And even at the back, there's a little hint of tropical, maybe lychee fruit, which I didn't expect. And this apple cinnamon thing, which is really confusing me because there's no logical reason for me to be able to detect that. And yet it is absolutely splendid and lingers quite beautifully. So while the method may seem very simple, just a single grape with a single fermentation, the end result is beautifully complex, and you can see why it earned itself a platter 4.5 star. It's a really, really very classy little production from the Daschbosch Co-op and well worth tracking down in your own time. So until our next video, stay curious, always drink niche, and subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel because we have almost 500 videos just like this one. And I'm not going to leave you alone. I'm going to leave you links to 2 more videos, both of which talk about some of the exceptional winemaking that is happening in the Breede Kloof region of South Africa.